Good evening. I'm Malcolm Clemens Young, Dean of Grace Cathedral. Welcome to the Forum Spring Season. The history of Silicon Valley, from railroads to microchips, is an extraordinary story of disruption and destruction. Palo Alto's weather is temperate, its people are educated and enterprising, its corporations are spiritually and materially ambitious and demonstrably world-changing. Palo Alto is also a haunted, toxic waste dump built on stolen Indian burial grounds and an integral part of the capitalist world system. In Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism in the World, the first comprehensive global history of Silicon Valley, Malcolm Harris examines how and why Northern California evolved in the particular consequential way it did, tracing the ideologies, technologies, and policies that have been engineered there over the course of 150 years of Anglo settler colonialism. From IQ tests to the tragedy of the commons, racial genetics, and the broken windows theory, the internet and computers too. It's a story about how a small American suburb became a powerful engine of economic growth and war, and how it came to lead the world into a surprisingly disastrous 20th century. Tonight, we're talking to Malcolm about Malcolm's urgent and visionary history of the way we live now and his radical proposition for how we might begin to change course. Malcolm, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We're so grateful to have you.
Thank you for having me. Also, Malcolm, I was just saying I should have made sure that I had my last name in the description today because it's going to be fun going back and forth. We'll try not to joke about it too much, I guess.
I know. I just don't run into too many more Malcolms, so I'm always really grateful. We had a kid in the congregation who was named Malcolm, and every time I see him, I just light up. It's just so fun to have that connection with him. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it was like to grow up in Palo Alto.
Yeah, that was the part of the book that I left out.
I know. I thought that was generous if you could.
In this sort of like Joan Didion classic California way, where you weave your personal experience into the historical experience. And it was also supposed to be regular book length. And so both of those came apart sort of at the same time. I discovered that I wasn't very good at writing about my own history. It wasn't very interesting to me. And there was just so much more of this material that I wanted to get in that it really like squeezed my experience out, which is in writing, it was really fun because I got to re-encounter my own story, you know, from the other direction, right? Starting in the 19th century, showing up, and I sort of like see the back of my own head in the historical picture that I'm talking about. But growing up there, it's hard because I in some ways I had sort of an atypical childhood. I was very politically involved. I spent a lot of time at the used bookstores that no longer exist. In some ways, I like grew up in the remnants of a Palo Alto that doesn't exist anymore, and that was well on its way to disintegrating when I was there. And there are still elements of that around, not least in Stanford University itself. But when I go back when I have occasion to, which is rarer and rarer, it's hard to even see the place where I grew up, whether it's, you know, the Lytton Plaza downtown where the punks would lean against the wall and smoke cigarettes, and we started our anti-war rally, to the bookstores where I'd hang out all the time, or even just like the groups of teenagers downtown loitering around. Like, it's a very different place. And that's a lot of that story is in the end of my book about how it changed from this sort of post-hippie family place that is supposed to exemplify this post-war suburban ideal to now a real like sort of yuppie central where it's got young tech workers or younger tech workers, even if they've got families, and appeals explicitly to that demographic.
Yeah, you know, I was the rector of the church in Los Altos, so just like right across the border. I'd ride my bicycle through Palo Alto to visit my friends who were faculty members at Stanford. And I did a TED talk at Palo Alto High School on basically it was in response to the number of students who were taking their own life. And there's that element too about, you know, that high demand. You talk about the Palo Alto system in your book. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that pressure to succeed, and then, you know what is meant by the Palo Alto system.
Yeah, it's really what the town is designed around from the beginning. So the Palo Alto system, as it was originally used, and I'm surprised it hasn't become this sort of foundational metaphor for the town. And in the histories of the tech industry and the Bay Area, you don't read about the Palo Alto system. But it's this really perfect metaphor. And it's originally described by this horse trainer named Charles Marvin, who was the director of the Palo Alto Stock Farm, which was this horse breeding and training facility before Stanford University, that took up the space of Palo Alto that was Leland Stanford's project. And they decided that they were going to breed the youngest, fastest horses that had ever existed in the world. And the way that they were going to do that is that they would race the youngest horses as fast as they could, as young as they could, which traditionally horse breeders didn't do because it's really risky to the horses themselves. And if you injure a young horse, you have to kill it. And they couldn't afford the expenses of that going through that much horse material. But Stanford, as a capitalist, was operating on a larger scale, and they were, with his backing, Charles Marvin's able to develop this model, which is really a financial model as much as it's a horse breeding model or horse raising model. And they create this kindergarten track, what they call a kindergarten track, which there is no kindergarten for children west of the Rocky Mountains at this point in history. But they build the first kindergarten for horses, and it's for these young horses to run around this track and be able to control them. And this model succeeds, and they're able to build really the youngest, fastest horses in the world by putting this life or death pressure on these 1-year-old horses, right? These foals or colts. I'm not actually a horse guy. You got to learn to fake it a little bit for the book. And now, if you said, you walk up to a tech guy and say, what's the Palo Alto system? They won't know this history, but they could probably tell you something about it, right? About how capital and scale and youth and potential work together to produce the best, fastest people, as well as machines and companies, and most profitable companies. And like venture capital as an industry is totally based on those, right? It's based on a really uneven distribution between winners and losers. And it's all about finding the one winner as young and small as you possibly can and piling capital into that. And I think this manifests as well in the way that you're raising young people. And what's interesting since the time that I went there is that at the time, Palo Alto had an exceptionally high suicide rate for young people. And I believe it's probably still high, but the rest of the country has caught up. And I think that has to do with really the Palo Altoization of the United States as a whole, that this wasn't just an aberration, but really leading the way in terms of how the country is raising young people.
Yeah, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the personal cost among your classmates, and because you've seen all of them grow up, and how is it continuing to affect them in their lives now?
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of classmates about people reading this book and learning this history and seeing themselves as part of that history, and I think that it helps to see yourself beyond just your own experience and to think about it historically and what are the determinants of your life experience. I don't want to speak for anyone else's, psychological experience. I think a lot of people are doing just fine, and some people have benefit from those pressures because that's how it's developed. That's how it builds. At the same time, I know that a lot of my classmates have a lot of experience with their friends and classmates and first girlfriends and first boyfriends, first, teammates from their sports teams, people who should be here and aren't, or should have been there when they were growing up and aren't.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's hard for people to even stop. Do you know what I mean? Even for the winners in the Palo Alto system, it's hard to not be totally consumed by that achievement orientation.
It's true. Well, and some people thrive from it. Some people profit from it. It's not like it's pointless. There are benefits to it, and you can see a lot of those benefits in Palo Alto and in the surrounding area, right? That even since I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, the area has gotten so much wealthier, so much more powerful. And so we have to think of these as part of the costs of that gain, because it really is, they've gained a lot. Even just looking at like housing price appreciation, right? Like people gain a lot, and they just have to, but they have to understand that that's part of the costs. And I think they do. And I think that's why you sort of run into a wall, and they've kept running into a wall over and over again in terms of how do we address this problem. And the issue is that it's not a problem. It's part of their solution, right? And so it's like, to undo it doesn't mean you just address this specific problem. Doesn't mean you build a higher fence, or you stop publishing news stories about it, or, there are a number of strategies we've heard about how to stop this from happening. But no one's going to say, well, we should really, has to do with the spiritual rot that comes from the disconnection of the Palo Alto school district from the Ravenswood school district. And we need to reassess how we raise children in this community. That, like, no one's putting that on the table as like, how do we create a better environment for our children to grow up in. They're thinking about it in terms of social science and how do you manipulate this situation at the lowest possible cost to your system as it exists, rather than thinking about, the world they're building for their kids.
Yeah, I loved the book, by the way. I am a student of California history, so a lot of the things were familiar to me, but there were definitely new things that I didn't know about. And I also like the way it comes right into the current day. That we're talking about, figures that are in my generation, and what effect they've had on kind of the global capitalism. Could you give us a kind of a summary of the book? And maybe a little intimation about how it came into being. Like how did this project seem when you first started, and then what did it end up being?
Yeah, well, it changed a lot, as I said, from what I started with, partly because I learned a lot myself about the place, and I before I written this book, there hadn't been someone who had gone from the beginning in the mid 19th century through to today, straight through without skipping. And there are a lot of histories that'll start with the gold rush, or start with Leland Stanford, and then skip ahead. And you'll skip through the radio age, or you skip to the radio age, or we'll go to the post-war. But if you take it step by step, it's a short history in some ways, which is kind of funny for me to say, because obviously it's a long book. But a long book that really does get through this whole history of this place, like you'd think it would take multiple books or whatever. It's not the same as American history, which extends over a much, much longer period of time. Anglo-American California history is really 5 generations is what we're talking about, maybe 6 generations. And so that was a really appealing to me as a book to pitch to my editor. I'm an author. I'm not a professor. This is what I do for a living. So I had to come up with a book to write. And I remember sitting with my friend who's a writer as well, saying, trying to think about what my next book was going to be. And what I told her was, I really don't want to write, that book about where I come from and Palo Alto and its history and growing up there and the suicides and weaving that history in myself, my personal narrative back through that. And I went on and on about this book that I really, really didn't want to write. And what she said was, well, it sounds like that's the book you have to write. That, history is what hurts, as we say. And there is a reason that I didn't want to examine all that and spend a lot of my time really working through Palo Alto. But approaching it historically in the way that I did, I think it ended up being a relief in some ways to really like understand this place and understand myself in the context of this place. So it's a little tough to summarize, except to say that it goes through this entire period. When I wrote it, I had a 6-foot sheet of paper in my bedroom that I had in 5 sections, or my office at that point. And the book is split into 5 sections that are chronological. One that goes from around 1850 and the founding of Anglo-American California and the gold rush to 1900. I go through 1900 to 1945, I think. 45 to 75, 75 to 2000, 2000 to 2020. And so the time period shrinks a little bit as we get closer to today. And so you're getting more and more about the years that are more current as we get closer to it. But it really does go step by step through the whole history, looking at these sort of main characters from Palo Alto and how they played roles in this real world system, that it's not just American history or California history even, but I tried to write it as world history because California is this real hinge point for the world system that gets developed at this time.
Yeah, I love the quote from Karl Marx about, get me more information about California because capitalism is so accelerated there. I mean, it was just such a prophetic comment.
Well, and that's the epigraph, and I did it a little jokingly because he requests a big beefy book on California. Tell me about economic conditions in California, and he doesn't get it because there isn't one, because
Yeah.
he's too far ahead of himself, or too far ahead of history rather. So if I could send him the book back, I would.
I know. Yeah, I think he'd appreciate it. I loved, for me, I think it really helped me understand Silicon Valley in the 20s, like new technologies like vacuum tubes, radar, all the avionics equipment that are required to make an airplane into a military tool, television. So I really became to a much stronger impression about just how far back the roots of Silicon Valley go. I wonder for you, what surprised you as you were doing this research and as these stories were beginning to unfold for you?
Well, that was definitely one of them. I mean, I had to become proficient enough in the technical elements to be able to describe what was going on and to really understand what was going on about semiconductor development and how do you make a computer out of light bulbs? Like, why, you look at those old computers and they're made of light bulbs, and like, how does that work? How do the light bulbs make a computer?
Yeah.
And so I had to actually like learn how that worked. And it was surprising to learn that like, oh, okay, like the audion is a triode, and like a microchip is, a semiconductor is also a triode. Like it was the same thing. It was the same technology being developed over time. It wasn't just some leap into the space age out of some brilliant person's mind or whatever, that there's this whole infrastructure that had been developed. And I think that period still is like within the collective unconscious of Silicon Valley, plays a really important role, both in terms of like the excitement of all the new gadgets that they were building and stuff. I think it's definitely continued, where you're talking about the like 3-man gadget shops where you've got a couple inventors with different personalities who are trying to come up with gadgets to make to improve people's lives or to find something to sell. I think that's definitely like close to Silicon Valley's heart. But also there's this moment around World War II where the inventors in Silicon Valley get sort of dispossessed for a moment by capitalists out east, and the radio conglomerates sort of squelch some of these upstarts, including Charles Litton, who's one of the like early stars of the Bay Area tech industry. And I think the tech industry, like, 100 years later, like still holds this wound in their heart somewhere, that like other capitalists are out to get them, and like the America doesn't really understand what they're doing. It doesn't respect them or what they're up to, even though that like long ago ceased to be the case. And Wall Street has come around, Wall Street came around a long time ago on Silicon Valley. But they still have this sort of attitude about other capitalists, other industrialists, politicians who want to get in their way, which is very funny because of how much of it is built on money from politicians who want to help them. But maybe they're starting to understand that a little bit better now. One of the things I was surprised to learn about was the politics really in like the 19th century, early 20th century, because I really didn't know, especially in the early 20th century. I knew that there was, 60s politics in the Bay Area, obviously. But before that, I really didn't know that it was a like world political center for anti-imperialism in the early 20th century, like pre-World War I. Like that's crazy. I just didn't know that story. It's really not taught as part of the history of the place.
Yeah, Grace Cathedral, the construction of Grace Cathedral was effectively stopped, halted because the dean and the bishop offended the people who were paying for the cathedral to be built, and it was all about the dock workers strike. So I mean,
Mm.
it's like taking a stand for labor, just like set us back like 30 years of construction. But you're right. There's such a rich history of the labor movements and of anti-colonialism all through the Bay Area, and that it's interesting. It's a kind of counter narrative that's part of your story too. You and I were before we went on, we were talking about how I said, there's just nothing you could leave out, and it would still be what it is. And I think you do a great job of telling the story in a very compact way. But what were there things that you left out that you would have liked to have included, stories that you wanted to develop further, or
Oh,
what was
absolutely.
like cutting room floor?
Absolutely. Oh, there's tons of stuff. I mean, the number one thing that people get mad at me about is the Grateful Dead. They think the cover is like false advertising, man. Because like
Me.
that when they see a book that's a history of the world told through Palo Alto with a psychedelic looking cover, they're like, this is going to be all about the Grateful Dead, because they think the Grateful Dead is a substantial number of people still think the Grateful Dead is like the most important thing that has ever happened in the world. And
Yeah.
it happened in Palo Alto. And so to tell something about the history of the world from Palo Alto that doesn't include that, only very glancingly touches on the Grateful Dead, is like sacrilege to. So I've gotten a little bit of complaints about that. Um, Again, like the length sort of gets me out of a lot of the critiques for like, oh, why didn't you include this? Why didn't you include that? But there are definitely some things that I wish that I had more space to talk about.
Yes, music and culture.
Thorstein Veblen
Oh
is
yeah,
one
right. Christine Veblen, of course.
who's a really, really interesting heterodox theorist who's got a lot to say about the dynamics that I'm talking about in the book, and who also has his own narrative at Stanford, who is a professor there who gets kicked out, partly for his politics, partly for his personal conduct, allegedly. He's a very interesting historical figure, a very interesting thinker, and I couldn't make it happen. I just couldn't fit him in. And there are a few people like that, but there are also, I think, ones that, yeah, and some of the bigger characters who get a lot of attention. So I don't talk about the United Farm Workers in here and
Right.
Cesar Chavez. I talk about other parts of the labor movement. I talk about other like parts of the Chicano labor movement. Uh, but that's just part of California history that I don't really tackle. Partly because it's not as tightly intertwined with Palo Alto, but partly because it's been written about a lot. And I didn't feel like compelled to spend the pages on that. Um, but yeah, I mean, nothing obviously can be comprehensive at any length about this kind of stretch of history. But so far, people have mostly given me a pass because this is about as long as they'll let you publish.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Without having a second volume, you write a lot about bionomics and eugenics in the book. And I think that's so interesting too. Just like the SRI, the intelligence tests, Terman. I wonder if you can talk about the ways in which the vestiges of that really dominant way of looking at the world, the vestiges that we still see with us from that Stanford view.
Yeah, well, and I don't think it's even just like to think about it as vestigial, is think about it like as a one way, falling apart of these ideologies, which would be great, but it's really not the case. They're totally cyclical, and it seems like it's really on an upswing in the Bay Area these days, especially among powerful tech folks. And I would imagine at least people in the faith community might be pretty disturbed by what's going on, and the real shift towards like racialist thinking, IQ thinking, human hierarchy thinking, uh, anti-humanisms of various sorts that are becoming increasingly popular in the Bay, uh, at least in certain crowds, let's say. Uh, but yeah, has like a really strong, not just one strong history. Like we can go back to the founding of the university and David Starr Jordan, who's a internationally renowned eugenicist. He invents this idea of bionomics with some other professors that he recruits from the University of Indiana, where he had been an administrator and where he sources a lot of his professors, including Terman. who invents the IQ test or establishes the IQ test in the United States and starts the sort of science of intelligence. To Shockley, who's a subject of these tests and does a lot to publicize them from a racialist and really neo-Nazi direction out of his literal funded chair at Stanford University, which becomes a real center of racialist thinking in the 90s, right? And that's the environment that Peter Thiel sort of comes out of as well. And folks like that who are now on top and are promoting those kind of ideologies. So you can see the baton being passed like over and over throughout history. And I don't think people think about Stanford or the Bay Area as like a center of American racism. They might think about that as even like a different historical period that like is not the West. But I think if you read this book, one of the things that's very clear is that this is not like something we were tricked into by the South or whatever, that this is really core to not just the identity of the place, but the structure of the place, to like how it's developed over time.
Yeah, it's so true. We had a forum guest on this last spring, and she was just talking about just racial covenants in the Berkeley Hills, like how Berkeley is divided up in a totally racialized way, and it's still with us. We still see it in housing prices and settlement patterns, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, which is a bestseller about housing segregation, his example isn't Birmingham, Alabama. It's Palo Alto, California.
Exactly.
Like that's where he's talking about, like that really pioneered. And I use that verb intentionally, right? They really pioneered these techniques of racial division from the foundation of the state, from the pre-foundations of the state. It was really core to the practice of Californianism.
Yes. The book is about capitalism. It's about the way global flows of capital completely shape our world, and especially about California and how it's developed those techniques of financing. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what socialism is, and in what ways it informs your thought and how you became exposed to it, and why Americans seems to be such a triggering issue for so many Americans.
Yeah, well, I mean, this history includes a lot of the history about why that collision has happened, because it's coextensive, right? The history of capitalism is also the history of anti-capitalism. And so if you're talking about from the mid-19th century to now, is this historical period of global capitalism, which means it's also a historical period of class struggle and the attempts to produce a post-capitalist state or state of being. So I started reading, left-wing Marxist thinkers when I was a teenager, picking up the books at the used bookstore that the last generation had sort of left there for me. And I didn't know until I was really working through this history that they had, fought these fights in the 60s, early 70s, really developed a whole lot of thought about what it would mean to struggle against capitalism and build a different kind of society based on the idea of global brotherhood, of the equality of all people, from the perspective of California, Americans in California. And that they were able to produce a lot of important thinking and activity that made California a center for like world left-wing thinking at the time, right? Like why were socialists and communists all over the world looking to California for left-wing thinking? Why were they looking at the Panthers and Angela Davis and
Harry Edwards,
farm workers and Harry Edwards and H. Bruce Franklin, who we just lost a few days ago? National, international, global leaders in the class struggle in California, like that's pretty strange, but it has to do with it being a location where capital is so advanced, right? And so you see anti-capitalist struggles really in this belly of the beast, as the Panthers called it. At the same time, you see heavy repression, you see like real conflict. And so that more than anything, like I didn't realize that I was indirectly inheriting this sort of new left experience and filtering it through my own activity as a anti-war activist, which I started really young, opposing the invasion of Afghanistan. I guess I would have been 12 in middle school or whatever, ditching school. I remember actually there's maybe some people know the Friends Meeting House in Palo Alto. Yeah. I went to my first nonviolent direct action training there when I was probably 12 or 13. And it was like me and my friend and then like all these old hippies and, Vietnam vets or whatever. And we were like the next generation of kids being like, all right, how do we do this stuff? How do we learn about this? So maybe that's not quite the answer you're looking for in terms of like, what is socialism? There are a lot of arguments about what it would mean to move to a form of social organization that's not based on production for production's sake, or class conflict and the exploitation of one class by another, but that assumes and makes real the equality of all people. But that's what it means to me. And that's when I see the struggle between capitalism and anti-capitalism. That's the territory of the struggle. And we can see what the outcome of that has been in the past 50 years in California. It's been really consequential. And not for the better in a lot of ways. We can look at the state of Silicon Valley capital and how it's triumphed and see decades and decades of struggle of which this is the outcome.
Yeah. Your conversation about Proposition 13, the Tax Reform Act in the mid 1970s was really eye-opening to me. You say something like 60% of the value of those tax benefits went to corporations and to landlords. And it just, to like gut the whole like infrastructure of the state and its ability to care for every class of people, all kinds of people, just for the sake of the benefit of the few. It was really eye-opening for me. I as something that I lived through, and it helped me to see it in a different context.
Yeah, one of the big benefits of that tax break was the auto plant in Fremont.
Yeah, Fremont. You mentioned that,
right? That is now the Tesla plant, which is one of the only non-union auto plants in the United States. Yeah. And so, like, why is the Bay Area leading the country in non-union auto production? Well, they're basically computers. Yeah. They're computers on wheels, and non-union computer production has been the bread and butter of Silicon Valley the entire time. We should think about that as sort of taking over the auto factory, right? With a computer company, and it in terms of its labor dynamics is more like a computer company than an auto factory. Although auto workers, I think, are doing their best to organize and change that.
Yeah, you talk a lot about just offshoring those different kinds of Silicon Valley jobs too. But those Silicon Valley labor practices, one of the things you shine a light on is just how abusive some of those labor practices are.
Yeah, and we really don't associate that with Silicon Valley, even though it's been key to the success at least as much as any individual invention is, and has been. And I think if you look at the history of a company like Apple, it becomes very clear how crucial this was to their rise in the first place. That's what was really exciting about Apple to capital in the first place is not the idea that you could have a personal computer, because a lot of companies could do that. They weren't the only ones who came up with that. It's that they had this non-union base, kitchens full of immigrants in the Bay Area putting together their circuit boards in a way that the big companies out east couldn't match, that they were stuck under these labor agreements. And so the innovation in labor relations is absolutely central to the whole economy, not just at that time, but it was also Santa Clara County was the center of temp work when temp work was just rising, when that form was increasing. Now it's the center of gig work, not just for like the country, but really the world. So it's really pioneering these modes of labor organization as much as anything else, and I don't think gets enough credit for doing that work. as much. Maybe they talk about HP and they talk about the factory floor and Hewlett and Packard walking around with the engineers or whatever, or Steve Jobs. They don't talk about Steve Jobs as much because famously not a very good boss.
Yeah.
But they like that, the hippie management techniques. You don't have to wear a tie or whatever. But they don't talk about temp work as characteristic of the area.
Yeah, you have a beautiful sentence where you talk about Uber, and you talk about how you to create a product that's so compelling to customers that they put pressures on regulators to give it a pass. And I'm just the evolution of these different practices and the different forms they take in different generations. It was really interesting to connect the dots between all those.
Yeah, Brad Stone calls that Travis's law for Travis Kalanick.
Travis's law, exactly.
And it's really smart. It's smarter than anything else that Uber came up with, right? Because they didn't come up with any of the other parts. And in fact, their idea for a business was wrong, right? The black car for everyone is not what happened.
Yeah.
That wasn't their thinking. But that Travis's law, this idea that you could overcome regulators by appealing to your users, man, that was really something.
Yeah. Yeah, so true. There's so many insights in here. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your connection to the Occupy movement. Just how and how things look, these years down the line, what your hopes were for at the time, and then just how things turned out, and how it looks different to us now than it did maybe at the time things were really on the boil.
Yeah, too soon to tell, as they say, right?
Yeah.
Even
30
however
years.
many years there we are now. Yeah, give me another 20 years. Well, maybe I'll be able to tell you more. So I was involved in the student occupation movement when I was at the University of Maryland, even though that was mostly occurring at the University of California campuses, at New School in New York, and in Puerto Rico, actually, where the real centers of activity for the campus occupations before it came to the occupations of the squares in 2011. Even though they were both very much about similar things, and student debt was a major theme of the occupations, as well as Occupy Wall Street. And once Occupy Wall Street nationalized, the whole national campaign, if you ask people, what they were really protesting, a lot of it was about student debt. But also some of us had a wider social critique. And the idea that the occupations could sort of break the left out of a kind of protest stasis that was shaped around organizations that were kind of sclerotic and not very dynamic, and that we could, through the practice of general assembly and the occupation of public space, leap ahead in terms of our tactics and strategy and public consciousness. And so, at the time, you have to behave as if you really believe you're going to trigger world revolution. And so that's what we did. I think anyone who takes on that kind of activity has to dare to win, or else there's no point in doing it. Or you're setting yourself up for a really bad time. Is that exactly what happened? I don't think so. Although, again, who knows when you look back historically, how people are going to periodize things. I think the occupations that we've seen nationwide around Palestine, in solidarity with Palestine, are not disconnected from that movement historically, even though some of those people are now professors instead of students, as I'm sure they're embarrassed about. But I think those same strategies and tactics are connected. And it also shows that we haven't figured out what comes next exactly, or that something is still developing out of those strategies and plans. But in general, economic inequality and class struggle as terms for national debate, I don't think I remember before 2010, 2011, and they were not on the table of national discussion. That's just not how people talked about things. And if you talked about things that way, you were sort of categorized as kind of crazy. And I don't think that's the case anymore. And obviously it's very generationally split. But I've talked to plenty of older folks who've been inspired by political developments that have happened since they've been adults or since they've been elderly even, So yeah, too soon to tell. I think we're still going, but I don't look back and say, oh, we really blew it. I think some people look back and say, oh, we really blew it. We should have done X. We should have zigged instead of we zagged. We should have formed an organization. We should have formed a party. And I don't think that's a very productive way to think about what happened necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think your point about the connection between protesters around what's happening in the Middle East right now, the language that people use to describe what's going on, and the frameworks that they understand, kind of frameworks around colonialism, et cetera. I definitely think that the Occupy movement influenced that way of thinking about the world and that way of understanding what's going on.
Yeah, and as well as further developments that have happened in the past 10 years, we've seen a really dynamic situation, right? We saw the anti-fascist resistance to Trump and Trumpism. We saw the George Floyd rebellion. We've seen and not just the George Floyd rebellion. We've seen like a movement against police brutality that goes back further. And a movement for racial justice that's really captured the nation's attention in a way that literally nothing has ever before. I think it's hard for people now to remember that only a few years ago we had like the largest uprising that this country has ever seen, and that was 2020. And a lot of people have put in a lot of work to try to get people to forget about that and get people to forget about what they were thinking at that time, what they were feeling about that time, what they were imagining at that time. But I don't think these things are over. I don't think that's the way history works, partly because I don't think they're resolved.
Yeah. I wonder, just with Donald Trump's campaign to be president, just what you learned in your research for the Palo Alto book that gives you kind of an insight into what's happening with this candidacy and with his appeal with so many Americans.
Yeah, well, and I feel like the Bay Area can no longer pretend that there aren't plenty of elements within the Bay that are Trumpist, right? That it's not just a problem with the South or a problem with the Midwest or a rural problem or whatever. That there are very, very powerful elements within Silicon Valley, within the Bay Area, that are not just like supporting or not just Trump voters, but Trump strategists. Larry Ellison is one of the most powerful people in the world. Is the founder of Oracle, and he's as far out there as any of them, doing election denial and Trump support. And like that's not unique to the history of Silicon Valley. That there have been far right elements within Silicon Valley this whole time, anti-democratic. Colonial, that have a plan and a plan for the kind of world that they want to see. And some of these folks are really, really public about their plan for the kind of world that they want to see. And it's not just Peter Thiel gets a lot of press, but it's absolutely not just Peter Thiel. It's absolutely not just Elon Musk. They might be the figureheads, but there is a whole culture. And again, they didn't just invent it. Even if they might think that they did, like they might think that they just came up with these ideas, they absolutely did not. Like it goes back to Herbert Hoover, no problem, like very directly back to Herbert Hoover. As anyone who reads this book will be able to tell you, because I had to include just dozens of pages.
About There's so much Herbert Hoover in there.
That was not the plan. It was not the plan.
But it was good. It was like it was helpful for me to. I learned so much about that period of time and about him as a person. One of the things I think about it's just changing so much is just communications technology. I mean, even the way that we're interacting right now. But I wonder if you can talk especially about Twitter and just Elon Musk's intervention in Twitter and just kind of what that means and how you see things going forward with our ability to communicate and organize online.
Yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, I think about something like institutions like Twitter or even like the New York Times as like sort of analogous to the American state itself, where we were talking about such large fields that are so internally riven by different like factions and agendas and processes, that even though it has a particular overall character, it's like reasonable to imagine yourself struggling within it. At least that's how I justify it to myself, continuing to spend way too much time on this platform. At least he's not making any money off of it, right? I mean, that's the thing that's really striking to me, is that this guy has not put himself into a hospital yet, to our knowledge. Because I think any other person dealing with that level of like stress and attention and pressure, and if I had borrowed tens of billions of dollars from Gulf autocrats and then pissed it away because I'm on ketamine or something, like I would have a hard time, right? Like I would go to my loved ones would be intervening or whatever. It takes a very special person to be able to make those kind of decisions over and over and over again and get up and do it again. I think Elon Musk is a special person, not in the ways that we're usually taught to think of him as special, but like that's an exceptional quality as far as I'm concerned. And I think as far as the world is concerned.
Yeah, to be able to be so passionate about things, and then you're right, to have everything operate at such a high level of stress and tension. I mean, some of it I wonder about just luck. It's something that you mentioned in your book too. Is just it plays a role in things. It's not everything's going to work out in the most efficient way or the most economically advantageous ways. There's just elements of luck that are built into things too.
Absolutely, but at the same time, like these personnel questions, the question of these individuals are mostly questions of personnel within systems. And so if Elon Musk wasn't Elon Musk, someone else would be Elon Musk, right? Exactly. It's like, it's not like history isn't being driven out of this guy's mind, right? Like that's, even if again, like he has to think that it is in order for him to do his job. That doesn't mean that that's actually the case. And we need to start, and I wish maybe some of the more of the reporting and analysis and our public understanding focused on the systems that are underlying these self-promoters, because they're really good at promoting themselves, but the people who don't want to be promoted are pretty good at hiding themselves, and we don't pay a lot of attention to how these systems actually work and who's writing the checks he's cashing.
Yeah, exactly. Here in San Francisco these days, people are talking a lot about artificial intelligence. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see that unfolding in the next few years.
Yeah, I don't believe in it. I mean, I don't even believe in intelligence, right? If anything, like, I mean,
right.
Like, literally,
human
like,
intelligence.
Well, as a unitary, the idea of unitary intelligence as a thing existing is very, very, very controversial. In fact, I think like controversial is maybe giving it too much credit. Like it's marginal. Like people who study these things don't believe in it. And if you study the history of how IQ was developed and the development of the idea of unitary intelligence itself, it's pseudoscience. It's ridiculous. Like they knew what they were looking for, and then they told a story about how it exists. But when you start asking about like, okay, but like, what is the thing that you're measuring? What is intelligence, and what is it? What does it mean? What are you talking about? It falls apart very, very quickly, and it's like all marketing language, and people keep waiting for the revelation of like the thing, but it doesn't exist. And in fact, like it's a philosophical argument. It's not even like like, oh, they haven't connected enough, electrodes yet in order to do it. Like that's not the issue. And so I see it as another story like crypto and NFTs, like the metaverse, of an industry looking for a solution for a world economy's problem, which is where do you put the capital right now? What do you invest in that meets your requirements? And it's been really hard to figure out what it is. And they've figured out that if we tell this story, then everyone will just build chips. Everyone has to have them. We'll start this chip race, and everyone is going to convince that this is real value, and we can just puff up these companies. And that's where the value, we found something physical that we can create, that we can just like push all this value into, even if its basis is actually a fairy tale. I mean, like when I logged on to this, tool we're using, I got to like, oh, try our new AI whatever. And what's that going to do? It's going to record our conversation and be like, hey, it sounds like you're talking about California. And it's like, yeah, I know we're talking. Like, what are you offering me? Like, what does any of this do? And people are very unclear. And it is sort of like crypto, and when like Coca-Cola is going to do crypto, and what does that mean? What are you talking about? And it turned out to be nothing. It turned out to be real, just advertising. And I don't think this is quite as much nothing as NFTs maybe, or crypto. Ultimately, I think it's an attack on labor. It's trying to figure out ways to make it easier to get people paid less to do important work or whatever. You're going to, after telling everyone learn to code, they're going to figure out how they don't need coders anymore or whatever. But ultimately, as like a solution for the world economy, as like a tool that everyone needs to install on every app, every company needs to have their own AI strategy. It's ridiculous to me, and really wasteful, and like, yeah, anti-human in a lot of ways, and like philosophically outrageous. And so I'm outraged by the whole thing. And that's before I even get into it as like a writer myself, whose like books are probably in some model somewhere, even though they didn't ask me if they could. And yeah, it's a mess. But I don't think it's like going to last forever. They're going to have to come up with another thing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The models are just terrible at doing religion and philosophy and the humanities. I mean, they're absolutely horrible. But it makes sense. I mean, if you think of a probabilistic approach to like writing a sentence, where if you say your sentence is on the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, and your first word is Kant, I mean, and then figuring out what other sentences that are like this in the human history, and then predicting what word should come next. I mean, it's just like, as a model, it doesn't make sense in terms of generating something that's really truly new or that's accurate. It'll be interesting to see what the next generations look like, for sure.
Well, in terms of like personal guidance, I can see it being really off-putting and like disturbing. And people talk about like AI therapists or whatever, or AI priests or what, whatever, what have you. Yeah, it seems pretty obvious to me that would be like really uncanny and disconcerting and make you uncomfortable. And like, I would never want to do that. Yeah. And so I'm not sure what the philosophical basis for this is so anti-human, and is so the idea of like, how do we get rid of this problem called other people? That's such a bummer. Like, what a bummer. Like so easy to root against them in some ways. And I think that's a problem that the industry is running into, is that it's really easy to root against them when they're doing this stuff. And they don't quite understand that, it seelike like.
Yeah. I wonder if there's like a kind of a spiritual, religious element in Palo Alto that isn't like explicit, but is something that's kind of behind the scenes. I mean, I definitely have such a sense of your respect for human dignity, but I wonder if there's more to it than that.
No, at least not in personal faith. I mean, I think there are elements of the Jewish tradition that are interesting to me, but that mostly have to do with people rather than God. Yeah. But this question of like haunting and being linked to the past, and like a psychic life that extends beyond your own like direct experience, I think is just like, I don't think you don't need to believe in anything necessarily beyond what you see to understand that that's real, right?
Yeah, I thought that at the very beginning you talk about places being haunted, and I definitely resonated with that idea of just, like I said, I walk up and down that street that all the protesters were walking up, when they were coming to assault Leland Stanford in his mansion. I mean, it's not like I feel their presence in a spiritual way, but I'm very conscious of them as being our predecessors, as past San Franciscans, and I'm the current San Franciscan, and in the future there'll be other people who care about the dignity of human beings and who are going to be acting on that belief.
Yeah, and I don't think. I mean, I know there are people who do feel their presence spiritually, and I don't think that's wrong or and in some ways it's validating of that way of approaching the world, right? Because if you can do that, if your approach to the world helps you to understand that the history is real and present, then I think that's a sign in favor of it, right? And that approaches to the world that believe that history isn't real and that that are solipsistic or that believe that everything is flowing out of your own ideas or whatever,
Yeah.
I think have a hard time with that. And in terms of how I'm understanding the world, I feel closer to the people who are like, I see ghosts or I feel the presence of spirits that aren't here anymore. I feel closer to that than people who are saying like, no, we can bulldoze whatever. Like that doesn't, it doesn't matter that it's a burial ground. Like that's ancient. And it's like, well, it's not ancient. It's present.
Yeah.
I've met their relatives. Like, I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know if you feel comfortable about talking about it, but you have like a proposal at the end of your book. I don't know if you're like keeping that secret for so people will read it, but
No.
if you're not, then I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that proposal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's a provocation that I end the book with. But also I think I'm able to make a pretty reasonable, coherent case for what I'm saying, which is that the land should be returned back to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, which again is not a like racial category of people or whatever, but a politically organized band of people who continue their existence on the land of their ancestors, to direct what to do with the land. And there's a global movement of returning land to indigenous people, not just as a form of reparation, but also as a form of response to our actual situations that indigenous people have throughout the world. Many different indigenous groups have strategies for preserving the land and preserving the ecology in a way that settler colonial societies don't. And right now you can look up during fire season in the Bay Area and look at the sky where in one of the most beautiful places in the world, and you can't go outside. You're checking your phone to see what the air quality index is, to see if you can go outside in, whatever, in the summer in the Bay Area. Like, what a disaster. This can't continue. We got to figure out something else to do with this. And again, this is a group of people who have an ancestral claim to this territory, specifically to the Stanford lands, which are held by the same nonprofit that was established by the guy who stole it from them, who was, as Stanford students can tell you now, not just a participant in the genocide of the native people of California, but the governor during this period, who is like, again, putting his name on the checks, putting his name on the bills that are driving people from their land. And again, this is not an ancient process. This happens 5 generations ago. This is
175 years ago.
Modern history, definitionally modern history. And whenever anyone says anything about ancient Indian burial grounds in Palo Alto, it drives me nuts, and I give them shit because these are modern Indian burial grounds. And the fact that you can't understand those terms together suggests that you need to better understand the place that you live in. And so I think Stanford should return the land to the Muwekma. There are precedents. I don't think that's immediately going to happen. I don't think tomorrow the president and the board are going to check out my book and say, that's a good argument. We should do that.
Malcolm was right.
And what I say is that even if they tried to do that, they would be displaced by other people who didn't want to do that. That if the president tried to do that, they'd be fired. If a board member tried to do it, they'd be replaced. That these are impersonal structures. But at the same time, the Stanford grad students are using now. There's been an encampment at Stanford, I believe, for Palestine. Things are changing, and the same history is still ongoing. It's not ancient. It's contemporary. It's modern. It's us.
It is. Hey, could you just say a quick, I can't believe we're out of time, but I don't want to leave before I hear about what you're working on right now.
Oh, great.
Besides having a baby, I mean, that's a
Yeah,
huge,
right. No,
wonderful project.
but I had to finish the book first, or at least close.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then the next book is going to be regular length. First of all, I turned it in already. It won't be 700 pages. It's called "What's Left: The Three Strategies for Progress in an Era of Total Crisis." So something maybe viewers would be interested in, but sort of looking at the political strategies, the social political strategies for dealing with what is really a total crisis of our social metabolism. It's not just global warming and it's not just inequality, but really the total crisis of our global capitalist system. And what are the different strategies that are in the field and how do they relate to each other? So hopefully that's something people will be interested in. We'll see.
I'm interested in it. I can't wait to read it. I'm looking forward to it.
Well,
It's
I have to have me back and we can do it again.
Yeah, that's right. Well, what I'd love to do is have you in person. I mean, it'll be much more fun for us to be in the same room together.
Definitely.
Please join me on June 2nd at 9:30 a.m. for an in-person forum with Michelle Neitz, USF law professor and founder of the Blockchain Law for Social Goods Center, about the ethical, regulatory, and social impact issues in blockchain technology, the power of blockchains to reshape the future of the internet, and how that affects all of us. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. There are many ways to give, including texting the word THINK, THINK, to 76278. I also encourage you to read Malcolm's book, and a link to purchase it is in the chat.